Hi, this is Janet, and today we have a different type of podcast where we explore how it is to research with especially traumatic material, evidence, photos, recordings, as lawyers and activists, as researchers and as journalists. Our presenter is Margherita Capacci, who started as an intern with us 3 years ago. Now she's our producer of our Patreon podcast and she writes our newsletter. Here is her exploration of how it is to deal with, as a female professional, traumatic material.
No one can act with impunity.
These are crimes that are beyond the pale.
We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about numbers.
We need a court. That's as simple as that.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg.
All rise.
Rape was frequently and deliberately inflicted. It wasn't the odd individual committing criminality. It is clear it was deliberately inflicted as part of the attacks against the civilian population.
It's April the 5th, 2022. The International Criminal Court's Chief Prosecutor, Karim Khan, is making his opening statements in the trial of a Sudanese militia leader, Ali Abdullah Rahman, also alleged to be the notorious Darfuri Janjaweed commander Ali Kushaib. He's in The Hague, accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity.
The attacks really were against the four people, the four villagers, their places, and the executions, the sexual gender-based crimes, the crimes against children, and the underlying persecutory intent in so much of this really is the bedrock underpinning this case.
I'm Margherita Capacci, one of the producers of this podcast. And that day, I was starting my internship with Janet and Stephanie. As is often the case with interns, I couldn't really do much to help. So I just had to start familiarizing myself with the field. I was sent these videos to watch.
The women and girls being raped included a mother and her two daughters. And all the girls that were raped were between 15 to 18 years of age. Ali Kushaib was beating the umdas, the elders. Most fatalities amongst the children were those that were under 5 years of age.
Back then, I didn't yet even understand the legalities of these crimes. But as you can imagine, it was the accounts and testimonies, the stories from the victims that really hit me. And I started wondering, how do women sitting on those benches or working in the field of international justice more broadly manage with being exposed to this type of material, day in and day out? What effects does it have on them? And how do they cope? This special episode is a result of that exploration. And a quick note before we start. Most of these interviews were conducted almost 2 years ago, and it's taken me that long to return back to this subject. I've changed. I've learned more about how to deal with some of the worst stories in the world. And of course, some of the words you'll hear may not reflect what the interviewees would now say about how they cope. Some of the professionals have changed jobs, as people often do in this world, and you can find all of the updated information in the show notes. Finally, to everyone who agreed to speak to me about such an important subject, and so openly, thank you.
I would say trauma probably was present every day in the majority of my legal practice.
For us as a Syrian journalist, partly personal experience.
I think acknowledging that I have trauma is the best thing to ever happen in my life so far.
My name is Myrna McCollum. I'm a lawyer. I live and work on the Pacific Northwest coast, so Vancouver here in Canada. I've been an adjudicator in one of the largest tribunals that ever existed in Canada. That was resolving acts of sexual abuse, the torture of children who were forced to attend Indian residential schools. And now I find myself doing a lot of training and keynote speaking on the subject of trauma-informed lawyering. When I was in other roles, like criminal law, oftentimes I and my colleagues would get files that were related either to deaths, so like murders, sometimes sexual assaults, sometimes other sorts of violent crimes, sometimes internet child exploitation. So a lot of graphic stuff, a lot of potentially traumatizing content. So my exposure, I would say, to the traumas of others probably began there. And then it just continued as I started to work my way through my career, examining people who experience like historical sexual abuse, physical abuse, acts of torture. So I would hear the stories directly from people who survived those institutions. And I would say trauma probably was present every day in my, like the majority of my legal practice.
I am Jodes Gavilan. I am an investigative journalist for Rappler, and we are based in the Philippines. I think starting in 2016, I have covered and followed and also documented the human rights violations under the war on drugs of President Rodrigo Duterte. The level of traumatic material that I deal with basically is first we have the first-hand witnesses. Basically, these are the families, the witnesses. These are the ones who were maybe with the victim when they were dragged out of their house and killed, or they were the last point of contact of the person. So in that regard, I deal with the trauma of the families. And I feel like their vessel, basically. As a journalist, I cannot just, it's offensive to just like talk to them and say what happened and then go away. So in our conversations, I usually tend to stay like an hour just talking to them. And it's maybe one of the first few times that they will be opening up after the killing of their loved one. So there's a lot of emotions there. They cry often. They describe what happened. They describe the aftermath, the effect on their families. I also deal with documents. Basically, these are police reports, and also I also go over photos and videos and of the incidents, the killings that I cover. I remember one time we got hold of 30 gigabytes worth of documents related to the war on drugs. Basically, these are police reports that basically say what happened in the incidents, the crime scene photos, and what were the injuries or the body autopsies. And I think the 30 gigabyte worth was one of the most traumatic materials I've dealt with outside of first-hand witnesses. I remember like sometimes in the documents, these are not like pictures, but described visually by text. So you see so and so had 3 gunshots to the head. So and so were discovered with her hands tied and her face wrapped in packaging tape. So I deal with things really visually. When I read something, I visualize it. So it became like automatic that when I read the reports, I visualize what happened. And it's bad. Like when you're reading books, that's okay. But when you're reading these documents, it really like takes a toll on you.
My name is May Scott. I'm a Syrian journalist. I'm based in the Netherlands for almost 10 years. During the Syrian war, I covered the war closely. I worked on a daily basis with a correspondent inside Syria. I was close to Syria on the border. For us as a Syrian journalist, and I also think for every journalist that works in a conflict area, it's a partly personal experience. And from the other part is like the materials and the people that you are dealing with. Because while you are doing your work, also part of your family, your friends, your neighbors are being attacked, or, they have to flee from a city to another city or outside of the country. So this is, I think, the big challenge that we have, the personal connection between you and the material you're working on.
The biggest mental effect on me is that I dream of these incidents. They seep into my consciousness. I don't even think about them on the daily basis of what I've done, right? But when at night, when I sleep, suddenly I dream, I have nightmares of these killings. For example, there was one time that I had a dream that I was in a mass grave, like this deep pit and I'm struggling to get out. And around me were dead bodies, bloody bodies that bear the injuries that I read in the reports. Sometimes I dreamed that I was being followed in the same way that a victim was followed, as based on how the witness kind of narrated what happened. It's like I placing myself in the scenarios that were told to me. I think I've become more anxious about things. I am worried of days that I do not do anything. I can't help but think of those things that I've witnessed. It kind of becomes natural to me to play back the cries of the mothers. So in that way, I try my best to like do something all the time so that I won't think about those things. When it comes to my personal life, I think in a way I became more close off to my family's friends. If other things happen to me, for example, outside work, I often always tell my friends about it, like my family, I open up. But because I'm wary of the sensitivity of the things that I deal with, traumatic material, and it affects on me, I had nowhere to go to. I just really didn't want that trauma. It's already secondhand trauma, right? I don't want like to become like a 6 degrees of separation. So I became close off. I remember one of my friends telling me that I feel so detached when I'm with them, and it's like a work day. She often finds me like staring blankly someplace else. And those were the moments that suddenly this traumatic material that I've handled suddenly comes into my mind out of nowhere. Or maybe like a family walking past me reminds me of this family that I talked to. And my family and my friends noticed that. But when they ask me what's happening, what's going on, I cannot tell them anything because I didn't want them to know about the trauma of my job.
There were a lot of effects. I couldn't see it then because I didn't know what vicarious trauma was. I didn't even really know what trauma was. Nobody talked about it, right? We were all trained to be lawyers, to do a job, to gather information, to process people through like our legal systems or administrative systems. Nobody ever talked about trauma. Nobody ever talked or asked really questions about how are you handling this work? How are you handling this content? And honestly, it was only when I started to experience panic attacks and depression and nightmares, and I started coping with alcohol, and I never really drank before until I was starting to become impacted by all these stories and these experiences and these images. I would say those were the red flags, but even then, I didn't connect those red flags to my work. I just thought, I don't know why I'm having nightmares. I don't know why I'm not sleeping well. I don't know why I'm starting to hate this job, why I'm having a hard time coming to work, why all I want to do is just drink a glass of wine and fall asleep. And it just started to become cumulative. And I just sort of felt like I was out of control. Like I was just feeling terrible all the time. And it was only when I had a personal crisis in my life, like the sudden death of my mom. Shortly after that, my life came to a screeching halt and I stopped working. I went to therapy. I was in very intensive therapy because I was feeling quite hopeless at that time and didn't really want to live. And it was really through the work of my therapist that I started to understand what trauma is and how I was experiencing trauma through my work. And in the form of vicarious trauma, yes, but also my personal traumas were being triggered every time I was working with people. Why? Because I had a history of childhood sexual abuse. I went to residential school, and now here I was working with people who all the time reminded me of that horrible experience when they would tell me their stories. And so it was through that work that I started to understand what the risks are when we're constantly exposed to the pain and suffering of other people.
As a journalist working outside Syria, then you feel that you are survival and your kid is safe. You have like a warm home, I'm living in the Netherlands. So I feel guilty sometimes that I am here safe and they are there facing the situation. And that made me, in some point, overwork because I wanted to prove to myself first that I'm doing enough for the civilians, for people, and then also mixing up between your professional mission and your personal situation was a little bit difficult for me, especially at the beginning.
So both vicarious trauma and secondary trauma, as I understand them, are phenomena or responses to the exposure to the traumatic experiences of other people. I'm Alexa Koenig. I am the co-director of the Human Rights Center at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. I'm also the co-founder of something called the Investigations Lab at UC Berkeley, which trains students and professionals how to use online information for human rights documentation, ideally for some form of legal accountability. The difference is that secondary trauma can happen from just hearing about or viewing, say, on a video, one traumatic experience that somebody else has experienced in the physical world themselves. You may begin to take on trauma or post-traumatic symptomology, like the inability to sleep or nightmares, etc. When you're talking about vicarious trauma, what you're really looking at is a build-up over time of hearing about or witnessing the trauma that other people have experienced. So a classic example of that would be the psychotherapist who's hearing from multiple patients or from one patient over long periods of time and begin to absorb that trauma themselves. When we talk about burnout, I think what we're looking at is where the stress of an experience begins to overwhelm your daily capacity to meet the obligations that are put upon you. This is really common around human rights activists, among lawyers and others who take their jobs very seriously, who believe strongly in the social justice mission, have a deep dedication, and therefore have a really difficult time being able to set the work aside at the end of the day and put clear boundaries in place between their personal lives and their professional lives. The long-term effects of that, though, really can be a lack of motivation, exhaustion that can't be explained otherwise, and an inability to really make the same kinds of human connections with your colleagues, with your family members, and an interest in continuing the work. And I think one of the things that we're really trying to foster is a sense of how to take better care of ourselves in doing such difficult work, because we're all investing so much into this field of practice, into our own careers. We want to make sure that the people who have really solid training are able to do this for the long haul.
I think it was only in 2020 when I realized or acknowledged that I have a problem. So that's 4 years into my coverage of human rights violations, 4 years since I was first exposed to traumatic materials. It took the pandemic for me to realize that I have a problem. I remember that was May 2020. I felt like I am in a dead end of my life. It's so bad that I didn't want to get out of bed, work, or even function that day. I wish I had a time machine that would push time forward by the time that I log off work, because I didn't really want to work. I didn't even want to see my friends online or even talk to my family, because for the longest time I felt that I'm a journalist. I have to be strong. This is our chosen passion, and there's this the elements of journalism, right? They say that the first responsibility or obligation of journalists is to the public, right? So I had this ideology that I have to always stand up for myself, be always ready to work, don't feel like I'm being affected by the things that I work or deal with. All these things that I put into my head to repress the trauma, the mental health issues that I've already been feeling in the past 4 years. And eventually during May 2020, I realized that this can't go on anymore if I just continue to repress this and use this, my passion, my burning passion, to hide this trauma. It will not do me good. And maybe I don't know, if I didn't acknowledge that certain moment, maybe I would have, I don't know, killed myself or did worse things to myself. So yeah, I acknowledged it, and then that's when the time that I became more conscious to seek opportunities to how to address this. So I've done this by, like, for example, first is by talking to a therapist, using my health insurance to talk to a therapist. Of course, therapists are like, they deal with a wide range of people, so sometimes their response is not tailor fit. I try to look for like opportunities that are tailor fit for journalists or for media workers or people dealing with traumatic materials. Because, I mean, my childhood is okay, my personal life is okay, it's just that my work, basically.
My name is Danya Cheko. I'm Canadian, and I trained to be a barrister and solicitor there, but I've been working in The Hague for about 13 years in international justice institutions like the ICC and different NGOs like the International Federation for Human Rights. I did review traumatic materials, documentary materials at the ICC and another institution, mostly testimonies, forensic reports, all the potential evidence around crimes. I am a very empathetic person, but I feel like law school and the training to become a lawyer is very focused on rational thinking and being very professional. And while, of course, we need to be professional, and there's, I think, a lack of attention paid to emotional intelligence and the ability to feel. So in one of my first cases I worked on, I was co-counsel in a murder trial, so we were defense, and the head lawyer had asked me to review the autopsy photos. There was no training, no one knew what secondary trauma was or anything, but the partner who was in charge of the case said, Danya, this is really hard. Big photos of the inside of someone's body. And I had never done that before. He said, I want you to take this home, these photos in a manila envelope, sit down at the table, and I'll remember it like yesterday. This was my first time dealing with heavy stuff. And take the time, breathe, have a glass of water, just make it that space. And he gave me that space, and it was hard. It was really, really hard, but I did it, and then it was easier, and I could do it. So I think looking back domestically, that was just that I think I was lucky with him. And so when I've had this stuff now, I've had the opposite, where there was no space for me to feel anything. And I did. I think we're human and we react. I think when you look at it over and over again, you can become kind of numb and shut it down. But if you never process it, I don't think it's healthy at all. If I hadn't had that change, I probably wouldn't have stayed in the legal profession, because I am a very highly sensitive person, and I didn't feel comfortable. I didn't feel like I belonged in the space because there wasn't really anyone, no one was talking about these things. So I think with Myrna McCallum's podcast, The Trauma Informed Lawyering, with the Atlas Network of Women, this is a group of almost 9,000 women lawyers working in international law. So giving these really supportive spaces, it even makes me emotional thinking about it, because it's so cool and it's so nice. And we can talk about secondary trauma. We share resources. I know I give peer support to women who had been harassed, which is another form of trauma. But it's just that it doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean that you're a bad lawyer. It doesn't mean that you're not highly skilled. It means that something bad has happened to you and it's impacted you. And if it impacted you more than other people, that's okay. We can talk about it. We can get help. So finally I had this huge space. It opened up and I learned about it. I didn't know that stuff could bring up my childhood or, that what does that have to do with this? And just to, I think, do a lot of self-reflection, which we're also not taught to do in law school.
My name is Maxine Marcus. I'm called Max. I'm the director and co-founder of Partners in Justice International, PJI. We are working in a number of different jurisdictions. There wasn't a lot of support, I would have to admit, in the institutions I was working for. There wasn't a lot of acknowledgement about it, and there wasn't a lot of support for it. I had personal experiences that made me aware of something similar to this, because my parents were genocide survivors. And so growing up in that environment, I was exposed to this whole thing about children of survivors and the trauma that's passed from survivors to children of survivors. That is, it wasn't called secondary trauma, but it is secondary trauma. And so I did have an awareness of that from quite a young age, from a teenager age. And so that, and watching my mother sort of talk over the years about her trauma and watching her kind of recover really from the trauma through the retelling really played a pivotal role in my understanding of trauma and my understanding of the importance of speaking it out. So I was able to recognize what was happening and not term it the way we term it now. I didn't know as much as we know now, but I did have an awareness of it. I can't remember a time when I wasn't working on these kinds of crimes. For me, I think I always kept going because I always believed that, like, if the survivors themselves or victims are able to survive that and then also come and tell about it in court, then who am I to say that it's hard for me to listen to, right? So there's a good side to that and a bad side. The bad side, of course, is that you're not attending to yourself because you're sort of kind of feeling guilty that you should have trouble listening to this because they went through it and all I have to do is listen to it, which is not accurate because there is a real trauma that can come from that. The good side is that it gave me a lot of hope and a lot of positive feelings. So I still, in spite of everything, have a very optimistic view of what we do, the potential of what we do. And I feel very fulfilled by it and very sort of fed by it.
My name is Kathleen Roberts. I go by Kathy. I'm also co-founder and co-director of Partners in Justice International, working with Max. We focus our work on national jurisdiction, so local practitioners, prosecutors, victim representatives, investigators, documenters, people who are seeking access for justice for victims. That's victims of atrocity crimes. I feel like the most important thing I ever learned about secondary trauma was that it exists, because then you sort of know what's happening, right? You can't otherwise sort of figure out what's happening. Why are you, outrageously angry, angry about something that should make you irritated, but not filled with rage, right? Why are you weeping over something that's not a big deal? I actually experienced secondary trauma for the first time probably 3 or 4 years before I learned the concept of secondary trauma. My first job out of law school before I even got my bar results was working on a death penalty case that was particularly gruesome. In this particular case, everybody said, oh yeah, the people who work on that case, they all have funny dreams. And boy, I had some funny dreams, and I was in a community that was very supportive, and I understood that this was happening because of the images I was seeing, the stories I was reading, etc. But I didn't really understand it until I started my job at the Center for Justice and Accountability, and they provided materials, information on secondary trauma, and I was like, as every paragraph I read, I was just like, like sort of the lights came on, or the clouds parted, or whatever. It was just all of a sudden clear to me what a lot of these like sort of weird, I guess, symptoms were, where they were coming from, and knowing that this is a real thing, how it works, that it impacts you, that it's not your imagination, that you're not being, making yourself into a victim or something, was really helpful for me. And so I preach it. No interns, legal fellows, volunteers, nobody comes through our doors in our remote office. Nobody comes in without hearing about secondary trauma.
Journalism basically in the Philippines in general, or mental health basically in the Philippines, dealing with trauma has always been taboo for years. I think it's only recently that the society in the Philippines and journalists themselves are acknowledging that there's trauma. Mental health is an issue, trauma is an issue, not just among journalists but also Filipinos. I'm lucky that my organization, the people are fairly young, but you'll notice that there is a disconnect, I guess, among journalists when it comes to dealing with trauma. Those who are from the older generations, you'll see like a certain lag when it comes to acknowledging or seeing that there's a problem when it comes to trauma and mental health in regards to the work that we do.
It's very, very, very competitive, our field, so that's another factor. Whereas in Canada, if you go to law school, almost everyone becomes a lawyer if you get to that stage. Here, though, it's more chaotic. It's kind of like the Wild West in a way, in The Hague. And so there's many people waiting in line for your job, in fact. So if you show weakness I don't consider it weakness that you are feeling upset about viewing traumatic images or photos, but if it's perceived as weakness, then yeah, you might not keep your job.
My name is Eva Buzo, and I'm a barrister and the executive director of Victim Advocates International, where, victims who want to collectivise and be active participants in justice processes, we support them to have that voice. Our biggest program is in the Rohingya context, but we also work in East Africa. For us, we're regularly engaging with people who are in a pretty stressful situation. And last year, a client of mine was murdered, and, after receiving death threats for a very long time, we were very close partners working together, for justice for the Rohingya population. And so that whole experience, around the threats, those threats were realized, and then the process afterwards, getting protection for his family, that's a lot of stress that goes into that experience, and that certainly impacts you. Certainly with some people, I'm happy to talk about it, and it's much easier to talk about them with other people. I think particularly when you're a woman in this space, there's a fear that if you kind of expose that vulnerability, that, you were affected by something, people are going to think, oh, she's weak or she's emotional. And I think that's a kind of overriding concern that I think maybe prevents open discussion about it, but to be able to talk about it openly like that, feels really good, because you go, you get flashbacks, I get flashbacks, like, oh God, I'll be sort of like doing the shopping, and then suddenly I'll be thinking about, like some horrible story that someone told me, oh, that happens to me, and that feels really good when you kind of realize that it happens to everyone.
I don't want to go back to the point of May 2020 that I was really dealing with a lot. There was a night that I cried a lot, and I didn't know where these tears were coming from, but I realized that maybe it was like years and years of pent-up trauma. I see my breakdown month like this blessing in disguise, basically. Like, if I didn't feel that overwhelmed, if I didn't seek opportunities to address my feelings of overwhelmness, I wouldn't be in this position where I'm more open with my managers to deal with my trauma. There was this email from the Commission on Human Rights offering this opportunity of like an Austin training with Berkeley Human Rights Center. There was a portion that talks about resilience. It really helped me, because basically my biggest takeaway from that was I have to pace myself. I cannot deal with these traumatic materials in one sitting alone. And because I did that with my 30 gigabyte document, 10 gigabytes worth of documents, I scored through them in a day, in 10 hours. And that was really overwhelming. And I realized when I took the training that it was wrong. It was basically putting too much burden on myself, on my mental health. And I should pace myself, especially when dealing with traumatic materials. It's different because if you think about it in the West context, they have the opportunity to leave work at 5 p.m. They have the opportunity to say that, okay, tonight, it's only about myself. I cannot think about work. In the Philippines, in the media industry in the Philippines, especially with how fast-paced things are happening in the Philippines, it's so hard to do these things. If I adapt this in my context, how would I deal with being on call? How do I deal with deadlines? And that's one of the biggest challenges that I face when it comes to adapting these things in the Philippine context. And of course, my organization is not that big. So what I did was I became more open, I guess, to my editors, to my boss, that I told them that I realized that I may have been pushing myself too much. If it's okay if I take this time off. Of course, they wouldn't know what's happening if I don't tell them, right? And it's been helpful because since then, I guess, they have been more wary of, not just to me, but also to everyone's limits and the impact of our work to our personal trauma. Of course, acknowledging that there's trauma is one thing, but to actually removing the trauma is a harder thing to do, and many people are not able to remove that. So Atrocity came at a time where I finding a way to address my trauma without leaving permanently my profession, because I love being a journalist. I love talking to people. I love, like, for the worst of it, I love documenting things. So when I found this 3-month opportunity with Shelter City, it gave me this, like, idea that, okay, I can take a break. I think this is the longest break I've taken in my whole journalistic career. And it gave me the opportunity to reflect, think about my life so far, and if the things that I'm doing to address my feelings, my emotional trauma, my mental health issues are enough. For example, I realized that I haven't had a migraine episode in the last month that I'm here. In the Philippines, I have migraines every 2 weeks. I think the biggest thing that I want to change about my daily work is trying to do a lot of things at once. For example, for stories, I interview 3 families in a day, and at least allot a time to process what I've just dealt with, and not directly jump into the next interview, the next traumatic material, because I understand that now that I have a capacity only until this certain level, and if I go beyond that, that would, like, do bad things to my mental health.
Sometimes we react to the pain and suffering of others with our own pain and suffering. So that comes out as a lot of rage or a lot of silence or a lot of disconnection, dissociation. And then sometimes if we are committed to, self-evaluation and self-reflection, we can identify our boundaries, like say, what's okay in the workplace, what's not okay, what do I need to feel safe and respected? And then when I am triggered by somebody's rage or somebody's trauma, how do I regulate my own emotions? And so this is where the positive coping mechanisms come in, right? So learning to breathe, to breathe deeply and slowly, slowing down. The impulse, I think, for many of us is to speed up when we're in an environment or a situation we don't like. We talk a little faster, we move a little faster to get past it. But I think what we need to do is just slow right down. Sometimes we have to become intentional about, our feet on the ground, our body in the chair that we're sitting in. Sometimes we need to take a break. Sometimes it just means 5 minutes to just be able to move our body, to take a breath. Sometimes it's a lot of self-talk. I'm safe, I'm okay, I'm safe, I'm okay. And if your day is particularly stacked full of things, one of the things that I think is a good practice is to have a ritual every day, like a steady practice. How do you put the heavy day down before you go home? So for some people, it's listening to a podcast on the drive home, a podcast that's calming. For some people, it's going to a yoga class. For others, it's going for a run. For others, they go play the piano. And that is how they let the day kind of wash away so that they don't take it home to their family. And I recognize that is really hard today. A lot of us have started to work from home and there's no separation.
Sometimes when I interview people, children, women, or men, that they went into a very hard times, it's very important to be stable and to ask the right questions and not to be involved emotionally with the person. So you have to remind yourself all the time that you are not their neighbor or friend. You have to remind yourself that I'm doing this work and I'm not letting myself to involve emotionally in this. But at the same time, to feel better and not to feel cold about people's painful times and suffering, you can tell yourself that what I am doing is also useful. It's good to be professional.
I think we have to listen to our bodies. I think we have to recognize when we're feeling anxious or sad. There should be that space to say, I need a break, or absolutely get some fresh air. I personally do a lot of yoga, meditation, a lot, because it really calms me down. And I've learned about different kinds of breathing to just ground myself. And of course, therapy. I mean, I'm Canadian. Everyone has a therapist. It's pretty normal. And it can be really fascinating if you're having trouble, to talk about it with someone else or peer groups. I mean, I also just found talking to peers super helpful. And then you don't feel alone. Like, oh, there's nothing wrong with me. And whatever your reaction is, it's you. Yeah, and get out of there if you have to.
And when it gets to be too much is when you take a break. It's not something that happens to me all the time. But if I do find myself in a place where I feel like I'm experiencing trauma, I basically am done for the day. I will go for a walk in the park. I will see my family. However, that, as I said, that hardly ever happens. What is much more common is I do regular things that are good for me. I walk in the park every day. I go to the theater. I cry my eyes out at the theater and watching movies and things. I spend time with my wonderful child.
I guess the label of a traumatic response might not always be right, but I can feel the stress, there's like a physiological stress that ends up happening when I feel emotionally affected somehow. So for me, I know it, and I know it's kind of coming. But like Kathy and I, we have an amazing team. Like if I turn to Kathy and I'm like, I need to step out, like I need to go. She'd be like, absolutely go. And then there's no question. There's like complete and total safety. I think that's like a critical component of how we can manage all of this. Of course, for me, my kids, of course, like Kathy said, my spending time with my kids, playing games and just doing silliness is great. And my daughter is constantly frustrated with me that I won't watch all of these movies these like really intense, horrible movies that she wants to watch because I can't watch them anymore. And I tell her I cannot watch. Like, does anybody die? Does anybody, I need like light entertainment. So that's my thing. And I have a wonderful group of sister friends who mean the world to me. So I think it's about the people that you surround yourself with. So my primary strategy is I'm actually an ultra marathon swimmer on the side. I swim every day for 2 hours if I'm coming up to an event. So that really helps me a lot. Because in July this year, I swam Lake Geneva. So I did one end to the other, which was 25 hours of nonstop swimming. Part of that was actually a direct response to the stress of my client being assassinated, because there was a lot that happened after that. And I really needed to escape to the water every day to kind of have a bit of time where my phone wasn't ringing, when I, wasn't being, bombarded with emails and having to do things. Like when I'm out in the water, you're completely uncontactable by absolutely anyone. And, it was a huge stress relief for me.
I think acknowledging that I have trauma is the best thing to ever happen in my life so far. Because if I didn't acknowledge that, I can only imagine what has happened since. Like, maybe I wouldn't be talking to you now. Maybe I would have moved forward with the journalistic career. That's the more optimistic output. But the more pessimistic one is I would have taken my own life if I didn't acknowledge that I have trauma. My friends often tell me that acknowledging it is just the first step of the long road to dealing with trauma. But for me, that first step is already a huge leap.
You've been listening to a collection of interviews made and curated by Margherita Carpacci, looking at how we as female professionals deal with the impact of traumatic material. Our next podcast will be on what methods our professions as lawyers, as researchers, and as journalists have developed to deal with secondary trauma. If you're affected by some of the issues in these shows, please reach out to fellow professionals for help. We've provided a few links of where you could find them in our show notes at asymmetricalhaircuts.com.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie Vandenberg, in partnership with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by Autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.